So I am teaching in Matthew 18, where you can all turn. Jared, are we good on sound? Very good. I maybe not very good about messages in season, but I don't really have a New Year's message planned at all, so I can't give you that, but we are starting a new chapter in Matthew, so hopefully that will meet your perceived need for new beginnings at this time of the year. But I am just going to keep plugging through my Matthew series, so that's what we're going to do tonight. Still very much in Matthew's 5th section, which I call the Suffering King Explains His Kingdom, because that generally is what Jesus is doing. He's explaining the kingdom of heaven to his disciples through this part of Matthew, and a lot of that at least has to bear upon his own sufferings for our sake. So that is my summary of this section. The Suffering King Explains His Kingdom. Now today's passage is related to what came before, but does take events in a new direction, which Jesus is going to pursue for much of chapter 18. So I'm going to start by reading the passage we've been talking about the last 2 times I've spoken, and then we're going to read into chapter 18, which is the first 4 verses of that are the passage for today. And then the stuff we're talking about today is kind of a good indication of where we're going for the next several messages as we go through Matthew 18. So let's go ahead and read this. I'm going to start in Matthew 17, verse 24, and then I'll read through chapter 18, verse 4. So when they, that's Jesus and his disciples, when they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons or from strangers?" When Peter said, "From strangers," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are exempt. However, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea and throw in a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and me." Now here's our passage for tonight. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Now this is the first of 4 passages in Matthew, all of them in Matthew's 5th section, where Jesus must teach against the self-aggrandizing tendency of his disciples. So there are going to be a total of 4 times in this 5th section of Matthew over the next few chapters where Jesus has to come back around to this idea, where the disciples are, in a sense, sort of dabbling with this idea of people being greater or lesser in the kingdom of heaven and wondering who is the greatest in some way. And Jesus has to set them straight on this. So this is going to be a topic that we're going to come around to quite a few times. And it really shows you a lot about the disciples at this point in their lives. And the suffering king in this 5th section, as he explains his kingdom, he has to explain to his disciples often that the kingdom has no place for those seeking their own greatness at the expense of others. This kind of tendency to make oneself greater than his brothers or sisters is not the way the kingdom of God is supposed to work. And Jesus has to deal with this several times in the next several chapters. This message, just thinking about tonight, I call it the lowly greatness of God's children, which again is my attempt to summarize in a very short phrase the stuff we're going to see in this message. It's about the lowly greatness of God's children. And in this passage, we see that the children of God must humble themselves to have greatness in the kingdom of heaven. So the way to be great is actually to pursue a very different route rather than pursuing the greatness itself, rather than pursuing a form of humility. Now I have 4 points on this that I want to talk about. First, the comments of Jesus about royal sons creates a question about greatness in the kingdom. This is the first part in chapter 17 that I read. I think it's very much connected to what follows, so I want to make sure we make that connection about how those events there about the tax and everything actually gives rise to this question of greatness. Secondly, Jesus treats these royal sons like unbelievers for their questions about greatness. So it is a very, seemingly out of place, but definitely the kind of thing that makes you stop and think about the disciples, and hopefully made the disciples stop and think when Jesus responds to them the way he does. Thirdly, to humble yourself like a child is to embrace the lowest standing in the kingdom. This is where we get to the real application of what Jesus teaches here, what it actually means to humble yourself like a child. And then finally, in the kingdom of heaven, all disciples are the greatest, which I think is the proper takeaway for those who have humbled themselves like a child. The right mentality is that all disciples are equally great. Now, I made a statement earlier that the kingdom of heaven has no place for those seeking their own greatness at the expense of others. And I will thank you to make sure that you remember the qualifier at the end of that statement, at the expense of others. The kingdom of heaven has no place for those seeking their own greatness at the expense of others. The problem with the disciples was not really that they were seeking greatness. What could possibly be wrong with wanting to be great? I mean, isn't greatness a good thing? Isn't that why we call it greatness? Even within Scripture, we see commands like excel still more, right? I mean, that's one of the things we're supposed to be doing, getting greater as time goes on. The kingdom of heaven is a great kingdom, right? Okay? So the kingdom of heaven is a great kingdom, and you might say the people that are in it therefore share in that greatness, and we're seeking to be greater still as we excel still more in pursuing Christ-likeness. So really, there's not a problem here with seeking greatness in any way. However, the kingdom of heaven does not work like the kingdoms of the earth. When you think about the way things here work in the world, what it means to be great usually has this necessary requirement of stepping on other people and treating other people lightly and doing things to them that are just not at all good. That's typically what it means in the kingdoms of the world to have greatness. That kind of greatness has no place in God's kingdom. In God's kingdom, greatness is held only by those people who live by the opposite principle. See, the worldly people and worldly kingdoms, the mentality there is step on other people, kind of make them your ladder as you climb your way up to greatness. In the kingdom of God, it's very different. Greatness is reached by serving people rather than by stepping on people. It's making yourself out to be less than them and acting accordingly. So this passage is not really a rebuke against seeking greatness. It's a promise of greatness for those who seek it according to the model lived out by Christ himself. Would you not say that Christ is great? Okay, how did he arrive at that greatness? Well, by being a servant to others, and we're following him. As Jesus says elsewhere, those who humble themselves will be exalted, which is exactly what Christ did. He humbled himself in many ways during his time on the earth, especially in dying on the cross for us, and through that he was very much exalted. And we are imitators of Christ, we're followers of Christ. That is our path to greatness, a path that we should follow. But it's followed in a very particular way. It's followed in a Christ-like way, which is a humble way. So although I'm not giving you a New Year's message, it wouldn't hurt to have this kind of mentality in mind as we move into this new year, to remember what the tenor of our life is supposed to be and how we're supposed to act toward one another and what mindset we're supposed to have as we pursue this kingdom kind of greatness, which even Christ has and has already modeled for us. So to start that, do my first point, which is the comments of Jesus about royal sons creates a question about greatness in the kingdom. And by the comments of Jesus about royal sons, I mean the stuff that we just taught on at the end of chapter 17. And I say royal sons because Jesus makes his comparison in talking about this tax. He refers to those who follow him, his disciples, as the sons of God, who is likened to a king. So these are royal sons. And if not hard to imagine, I think, a bunch of royal sons, princes, arguing about who's the greatest. It's the kind of thing, if you do get a bunch of princes together, what are they going to be doing? They're going to be trying to outdo one another in terms of who's more awesome. It's just what these kinds of people do. Well, here the sons of this kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, kind of get into that same mentality, discussing who is the greatest. Now, Matthew, I think, really does imply a connection between this passage on greatness and the prior passage about this sanctuary tax. So I want to make sure I show you why I think that. Let's go ahead and read that passage again and then read the very first part of chapter 18. So just to get it in front of you. When they came to Capernaum, those who collected the 2 drachma tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the 2 drachma tax?" Peter said, "Yes." And when Peter came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect customs or poll tax? From their sons," the princes, the royal sons, "or from strangers?" When Peter said, "From strangers," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons, the princes, the royal sons of the kingdom, are exempt. However, so that we do not offend them, go to the sea, throw in a hook, and take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for you and me." At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Now, our first clue that Matthew sees a connection here between these two passages is how he begins the story. At that time. It's the way chapter 18 begins, verse 1. At that time. In the very least, this means that the question about greatness occurred at the same time as the teaching about the tax. You almost get the feeling that before Peter can even leave to go catch this fish to pay this tax, the other disciples kind of chime in and say, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Or maybe right after Peter came back. But sometime very closely related to this time where this discussion about the tax happened, they asked this question about greatness. So in the very least, Matthew links the two in time. But you have to ask the question, why bother saying that? Why bother linking these two events in terms of time? Typically, we only describe two events as joined in time because we see them as joined in some other way. If you're telling a story and you say this happened and then at the same time this happened, you want to create the idea to those listening to you that they're somehow related, that they're somehow linked. So I presume that Matthew is doing the same thing. This phrase is our first clue that Matthew sees a connection between the two events. He says, at that time, to show you that this discussion about the tax is somehow related to what comes up with this question about greatness. But we have another clue. Our second clue is a word which, unfortunately, is not always present in all the English translations we have, but it is in the NASB, and that word is then. It says, according to the NASB, my translation here, the disciples ask, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, the presence of that word implies that they're asking a question based on something which just happened. There was some event, and then on that basis, they ask this question, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who then is greatest in the kingdom? Now, those of you using the ESV, you're using a translation which does not include that word then. I believe I have that correct. I looked it up beforehand and saw that it was missing there. It really comes down to a matter of interpretation. It's not a matter of them totally messing up or anything. It's just a matter of what kind of force they put on that word. The word in Greek is ara. It's a word that very often does imply this kind of logical connection, between this and that. On this basis, this other thing happens. So who then is greatest in the kingdom? It does sometimes, however, just kind of get used in this looser way of making a question more lively, I think is the way one of my dictionaries put it. Makes a question seem a little bit more impactful. So I think that's probably the way the ESV translators take it. That's probably why they leave it out. They don't really see it as doing a whole lot there. However, the normal meaning of the word does have this kind of logical idea of connecting two things because they're related logically. And also we already have this sort of time statement at that time showing you that Matthew sees a connection here. It seems like both things together kind of amplify one another, and it seems to me you just want to translate it. At that time they came and asked, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? It all makes sense when you put it together. So I take this as very much a second clue that Matthew views these two stories as being linked together somehow. The story about the temple tax and this question about greatness in the kingdom. So I do think there is a connection. As for what that connection is, that's the next thing we're going to deal with. That connection, I think, is this. A few aspects of Jesus' teaching on the tax could lead to the disciples' question. Some of the things he said as he's talking about this 2 drachma tax for the sanctuary, some of the things he says there could very much lead to them wondering about the nature of greatness in the kingdom of heaven. When Jesus argued that Christians were exempt from the sanctuary tax, his argument was based on the fact that we are the sons and daughters of a king. We're children of a king, right? We are, in some sense, princes and princesses of this kingdom of heaven. Now, among the kings of the earth, this is an analogy that Jesus himself makes, among the kings of the earth, every king tends to have a favored son, one that's kind of marked out for special favor, maybe because he's the heir, or maybe there are several favored sons, the princes that are kind of lining up to maybe be the next king someday, and the king kind of includes them in on more things, gives them more privileges. That's how the kingdoms of the earth work. That's how the kings of the earth do things. Well, Jesus just made a connection here between the kings of the earth and the way things work in the kingdom of heaven. So that maybe raises the question, is that same kind of thing going on with the sons of the kingdom of heaven? Does God have his favored sons? Does God have princes that are kind of a cut above the rest? Does the same thing happen in the kingdom of heaven as among the kings of the earth? And the question there is more than just theoretical. It's more than just, hey, I wonder what if God does this. It actually does have some bearing on what's going on in this 5th section of Matthew. Because if you'll remember, Jesus has been reminding the disciples of his coming death. Jesus has told them 2 different times now that he is going to die. And they don't really understand what all that means and what all the resurrection means. But Jesus' death is forthcoming. So the question is, who takes over, right? I mean, when the king is going to die, the most pressing question is, who takes over? We need a smooth transition of power. Okay, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven then? If Jesus is somehow on his way out, I mean, who's going to take over? We got to know who the greatest is so that we can have this transition of power, so to speak. That would be sensible for the disciples to ask that question. You can understand how the disciples would hear and see all of this and ask, at that time, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So to be fair to the disciples, you can see why they would ask that question. And to be even more fair to the disciples, you can see other events in Matthew's gospel which could provide even more reason to ask this question about greatness. It's not even really limited to this time when Jesus is talking about this tax. There are other things we could say. Jesus, let's start here. Jesus had whole crowds following him, right? Lots of people all over Palestine following him. But only some of them were actually called disciples. Throughout Matthew, you see you have the crowds and you have the disciples, those who are actually learning from Jesus, right? So you have that kind of distinction. You have crowds, and then more important than the crowds are these disciples, right? And then, even among the disciples, you have only 12 of them in Matthew chapter 10 that are designated to be apostles. Only 12 of these people, right? So you have these 12 men who are going to be with Jesus and who are going to be doing miracles even, right? They're going to go out casting out demons, healing the sick, doing all this stuff. Does this suggest a greater rank? Is the pecking order in the kingdom of heaven member of the crowds, member of the disciples, member of the apostles, with there being fewer and fewer people as you go up the line there? We can go even further. Among those 12 apostles, it seems like Peter, James, and John get special treatment. We've seen that so far. We've seen those 3 men kind of get more privileges than the others. Only they were allowed to see the healing of Jairus' daughter. Only they were allowed onto the mountain to see the transfiguration. Everyone else has to wait outside or wait at the foot of the mountain. Meanwhile, Jesus heals this woman, this girl, bringing her back from the dead, and Jesus goes up on this mountain and becomes transfigured into this glorious appearance. Are these 3 men, perhaps, the greatest of the great? Seems possible. And then, even among those 3, there's Peter. When Matthew lists out the 12 apostles, he calls Peter the first. He always says, first Peter. And then Peter, you also see recently, he's made steward of the kingdom of heaven. To him is given the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever he binds is bound, whatever he looses is loosed. Okay? You have that going on with Peter. And more recently, you see that Jesus arranged for Peter's sanctuary tax to be paid by this miracle. You don't see him do that for the other disciples, do you? It's just go catch this one fish. In that fish's mouth will be 1 coin to pay the tax for both you and me. And you can almost imagine the other disciples being like, what about us? Why aren't you paying our tax for us? Why just Peter? Is Peter perhaps the greatest of the greatest? Is there a rank? Crowds, disciples, apostles, the 3, the 1. You see all this stuff going on in Matthew so far, and you can put it all together and realize there's a reason why maybe the disciples would ask, especially at this time, about the nature of greatness in the kingdom of heaven. Especially based on what Jesus just said about God having these sons in the kingdom who receive privileges, who don't have to do what maybe everyone else is doing at this time. And then that, with everything else, you can see how they would ask the question. However, this gets into my second point. Jesus does seem to sense something not quite innocent about this question. In spite of all the logic going into it and all the reasons you can see why the disciples might have brought this up, Jesus seems to treat matters as being a little bit more serious and maybe treating the disciples as though they're not quite on the side of righteousness in this. And I say that because Jesus treats these royal sons like unbelievers for their question about greatness. The way he speaks to them is the way you might think of him speaking to those who are not actually disciples at all, those who are outside the kingdom. Some of Jesus' words in this passage are just out of place for an audience of believers. It's not the way, for example, that I would speak to any of you that I know are Christians. It's just not the way I would speak to you. But Jesus speaks to them using some of these words and phrases that are just a little bit odd. For one thing, Jesus tells them to focus on entering the kingdom. Let's read this passage again, the first 3 verses. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Notice the difference between the question and the answer. The disciples asked a question about who is the greatest in the kingdom. Jesus' answer is about entering the kingdom. They're asking about, okay, so since we're in the kingdom, who's the greatest in the kingdom? Jesus, however, takes them back to the concept of entering the kingdom. It's as though Jesus says, forget about greatness in the kingdom, you still need to enter it. You still have to get in. That is a kind of, jarring thing for him to say to them. And if that was not enough to raise your eyebrows, Jesus also tells them to be converted. How about that word? He says, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." Now the ESV says to the disciples, you need to turn. That is a very literal translation. The word literally is turn, that kind of thing. It is very much a turning. But of course, you should know that this kind of language and this word, they do get used in ways that are very spiritual to refer to a spiritual turning away from sin and toward God and toward righteousness. That is certainly the way this word gets used. I will read one other passage to you that uses this same word for turning. This is from John chapter 12, verse 40, which is actually a quotation from Isaiah, but we're going to read it from John. John 12:40, this is describing what God has done to this generation who saw Jesus. It says, God has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart so that they would not see with their eyes and perceive with their heart and be converted, and I heal them. And the word there is turn, but the NASB translates it converted, because again, we're talking about a turning away from sin and toward God. This generation can't do that. Coming back here in Matthew, he uses this word of a very spiritual truth. Turning in what way? Turning away from sin toward God. And that's the word he uses. He tells them to be converted, which is what you would say to an unbeliever. And so Jesus treats these men like unbelievers and tells them to forget about greatness and focus on conversion and entering the kingdom. An amazing thing to say to these men who, more closely than anyone, have been following him so far in his ministry. The ones he chose to be apostles. And at this point, people like to ask the question whether the disciples actually are true believers at this point. Are they saved? Have they already been converted or not? This debate does arise here. It's a fair question. It's a question you can see why it gets asked based on the things Jesus says to them here. Let's not forget that Judas was there. How about that? There's at least one man there who is not a true believer, not truly converted, has not entered the kingdom, a guy who is very much just there for the purpose of betraying Jesus later on. So what about the rest of them? Are they maybe in the same category? You could maybe put that spin on things and ask the question from that direction. However, there's the other side of it, that Jesus just referred to them as sons of God and said, because you're sons of God, you're exempt from these things that Israel has had to do all this time because they were being treated like strangers. You guys are not strangers. You are sons of God. You're the sons of the kingdom. You're royalty in the kingdom of God. So putting that spin on it, you could say, well, it's pretty clear they're believers. You see that this all leads to a lot of speculation. We can go back and forth on a lot of it. What we can say is that wherever the 12 are spiritually at this moment, we can still see the heaviness of this response given to them by Jesus. Whether you want to view them as unbelievers being exhorted to finally be converted for real, or whether you want to see them as believers being strongly rebuked for a mentality that is characteristic of an unbeliever, however you want to view that, this shows you the heaviness of this statement made to them by Christ. The 12 are thinking about being bosses, and who's the greatest boss of all the bosses? And Jesus says, no, you're not bosses. You guys are still interns. You're like barely in the door. You guys have the complete wrong mentality about yourselves. You're not ready for this idea of greatness yet. You need to focus on entering the kingdom and being converted. And in this way, you can actually see how Matthew is serving both of the purposes for his gospel. I've talked about his purposes in evangelizing the Jews as he writes his book, but also about discipling them and taking those Jews who have believed in Christ and leading them along further in the faith. Matthew wants to evangelize those Jews who have not yet become Christians. To that end, he records one of Jesus' most challenging descriptions of true conversion, humbling yourself like a child. You want to be in this kingdom? You want to serve Jesus as the Messiah? You want to embrace these things? Okay, humble yourself like a child. Try that out. A very challenging word there for those who are thinking about following Christ. Meanwhile, those who have already made this commitment, already become followers of Christ, Matthew wants to disciple them. So here we see the Master confronting his disciples on a basic lesson that they have somehow failed to grasp. Humbling yourself like a child. How have you guys gotten along this far already and totally forgotten this very important thing? Perhaps it's good in that sense that the disciples are so ambiguous at this point. Perhaps it's good that we can't say for sure where they are, whether they're believers or not, because it allows them to stand for both kinds of people. Whether you're looking at them from the standpoint of those who need to be converted for real or those who need to just act like they have been converted, either way, it allows them to serve as examples for both audiences, those who need evangelizing and those who need discipling. So maybe it's good that it's kind of vague, and maybe we can't really know for sure where they are at this point. But whether you are one of the royal children of God or aspire to be one of the royal children of God, you must remember this rebuke, lest you be treated like an unbeliever or actually remain one forever. It goes both ways. You need to remember this regardless of what kind of person you are, whether converted or not yet converted. This is a lesson very much for you, no matter who or what you are. Now, Jesus teaches that the way to avoid the terrible fate of being shut out of the kingdom is to humble yourself like a child. And the way to pursue greatness in the kingdom is to humble yourself like a child. Since this is the critical moment for you eternally and the critical moment for seeking whatever kind of greatness you desire, this is the critical moment here, humbling yourself like a child. I have to explain what that means. You're not going to get very far with this message at all if I don't spend any kind of time trying to figure out what does it mean to humble yourself like a child. Well, here is what I concluded. To humble yourself like a child is to embrace the lowest state, the lowest standing in the kingdom. So to humble yourself like a child is to embrace the lowest standing in the kingdom. And just how low that is may surprise you. I hope I don't insult any of the children present in describing the lowly state of a child. But a lowly state, a low standing. In this passage, we're talking about humility, right? By humility, I think Jesus refers to a lowly state, all right? Now, I'm going to contrast that with another definition of humility, which is very valid and which I've actually used before. I once gave a definition of humility that went something like this, that humility is a reserved attitude toward your own positive traits. So whatever is good about you, you yourself don't think too much about those good things about yourself. All right, I did give a message one time that was entirely framed around that definition of humility. But that definition of humility is not what Jesus is talking about in this passage. So I only bring it up to you to tell you to ignore it and not think about that for this message. I mainly think that this sort of humility has no bearing on this passage because children are not usually humble in that way. And if I may be very frank about this, having been formerly a little boy myself, little boys especially are not humble in that sense. Little boys like to shoot their mouths off and they think they're awesome when they're really not. It's just kind of the way it comes with the territory. And little girls can be that way too, but I think children in general, when I see children, I don't necessarily think they're really humble. They have a reserved attitude about their own positive traits. I don't think it works that way. Just as I look at children and watch them, I don't think of them as being humble in that sense. So, in what sense is a child humble? Are there any other definitions of humility that we can find? Well, there is another use of the word humble. It's a very slightly different sense. It refers to something that is simply lowly, something that is kind of low on your ranking of what you would like it to be. It's not very desirable, not very impressive, not very necessary, don't really need it, don't really want it. It's a humble thing. So for example, if my house is perhaps not very desirable, or my apartment, I might welcome you in and say, welcome to my humble home. It's not much, but here it is. That kind of humility, it's lowly, it's not that impressive. Or maybe if I have a job which is not very remarkable, I might say I'm just a humble working man. That's all I do. It's not much, but it's my job. Not very impressive, but it's what I do. It's humble in that sense. It's lowly. Sometimes we just use the word humble to refer to something that is considered low on a scale of greatness. If you can rank this on a scale from 1 to 10, the humble side is down here, the lowly side. It's 1, 2, or 3. The Greek word used here for humility, tapainao, is very much capable of that meaning. And I want to read you one passage where you see Paul use it this way. This is from Philippians chapter 4, verse 12. I just want to read it briefly so you can see it. This is what Paul says here. This is a very familiar passage. He says, I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having an abundance and suffering need. Okay? So he says he knows how to get along with humble means and also how to live in prosperity. Okay, so how do you live? Well, you either live in prosperity, at the top of your game, fancy stuff, fancy job, nice house, all that stuff, or to have humble means. Not a lot of stuff, not a really good house, not a really good job. You know, in Paul's case, whether he has a lot of support from the churches, doesn't have a lot of support, you know, whether he is being treated very well by people or not treated very well at all, whether he's in humble means or in prosperity, he can get by. He can handle it. You see how he's using the word humble there? He's not talking about his attitude. He's not talking about how he views himself. He's talking about, what is my condition? In what state am I right now? I'm in a lowly state. I'm in a humble state. Things aren't that great right now, but I can make it work. That's how he's using the word humble. And that is how I think we should understand the word over here in Matthew 18. It's not talking about an attitude in which you kind of view your own positive traits with a kind of reserved attitude. It's talking about what is your standing. It's talking about a lowly standing. So that, I think, is what he has in mind when he talks about this. And he says that you should humble yourself in this way like a child. So to the degree that a child has a lowly standing, you also should give yourself this low standing. So what does that mean? What is the state of a child? What is the standing of a child? How lowly are these children on a scale of things? Well, begging the children's pardon, if you're a child, your standing is basically the same as the state of a slave. And I'm going to use that word specifically, and I'm going to make it a huge crux of this message. I think it's very important to realize here that if you're a child, and I don't necessarily mean in the ancient world, but if you're a child, your standing is not that different than the state of a slave, which is very lowly. Okay? Let's think about this. You parents, think about your children. And maybe you kids, those of you that are listening, you check me on this, okay? You tell them what to do, you tell them what not to do, you punish them for disobeying. Your children have nothing of their own. Everything they have was given to them, and you can take it all back if you want. Kids, does that sound right? Is that how life is for you? What kind of life is that? Who else lives that way? Can you think of any other part of the population that lives that way? Slaves. I mean, they get told what to do all the time, get punished if they disobey. They don't have anything. What they do have, they can lose just because the master wants to take it back. This is slavery. That's what childhood is. It is a state that is, in all practicality, the state of slavery. Here is an interesting quirk of language, if you think I'm crazy on this. In Greek, you have one of these words for children. The word is pais. Okay? Pais means child. You know what else it means in Greek? Slave. So if you talk about your pais, maybe you're talking about your child. You might be talking about your slave. It could go either way. Why do they have one word for both concepts? Why do they have one word for child and slave? Well, because in their minds they were very similar. But you know what? It's not just Greek. One of the demeaning ways in the past that white slave owners would refer to their black slaves, calling them boy or girl. I'll send my boy to do it. I'll send my girl to do it. Get in here, boy. Get in here, girl. Just, why are you calling them boys and girls? They're grown people. Why are you calling them, why do you treat them like children? There's an overlap. Childhood and slavery. Practically speaking, the way both groups live, very similar. Same standing. It should not be surprising to think that the humble state of a child is basically the same as a humble state of a slave. It's very true to real life. Whether you're a slave or a child, your life isn't really all that different in terms of the practical day-to-day stuff. Getting told what to do, getting told what not to do, getting punished, getting your stuff taken away. That's kind of how it is. And in this passage, I think Jesus has the slave-like state of children in mind. When he says to humble yourself like a child, he means get as low as a slave is, because that's how low a child is. I think that because it fits with how Jesus answers the disciples on this same point elsewhere. Let's go a little bit further in Matthew. There is, again, several times where this concept of greatness comes up, and Jesus has to deal with it. Let's see how he deals with it in chapter 20, verse 20. Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, bowing down and making a request of him. And he said to her, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "Command that in your kingdom these two sons of mine may sit, one on your right hand and one on your left hand." So here's a power grab. And they didn't have the guts to come to Jesus and ask themselves, so they got their mama to do it. But Jesus answered, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I am about to drink?" And they said, "We are able. Anything you take, we can take," which is very pompous on their part. And he said to them, "My cup you shall drink, but to sit on my right hand and my left hand, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom the Father has prepared it." And hearing this, the other 10 disciples, became indignant. They became angry with the two brothers. And Jesus called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men, exercise authority over them. It is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant," which is a very politically correct way of saying slave, I might add. "And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave," in case you had any doubts. "Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So even Jesus occupies the role of a slave. He comes not to be served, but to serve, in giving his life as a ransom for many. And that's the example he gives for them. Don't try to be great like the great lords of the earth. Be like a servant. Be like a slave. So in one passage, when the issue of greatness comes up, he says, don't pursue that, be like a slave. In the earlier passage, when greatness comes up, he says, don't pursue that, be like a child. So there must be some kind of similarity here. And when you look at the practical day-to-day stuff of being a child and being a slave, it's not really that different. So when I see Jesus telling his disciples to pursue greatness by humbling themselves like children, I think it's reasonable to explain that by looking to the slave-like traits of childhood. Slaves are so low on the scale of greatness, I mean, they're just practically nothing. In any society, the slaves always have the fewest rights, the smallest amount of honor, no dignity, and children, well, we kind of treat them the same way. Do this, stop doing that. No, you can't have that anymore. Just, that's childhood and that's slavery. Basically the same thing. It comes all together. So to humble yourself like a child is to embrace that lowest standing in the kingdom, the status of a mere slave. Someone who just is very, very low on that scale of worth, that scale of greatness. Now, let's say you've done that. Let's say you've humbled yourself like a child. You've adopted the childlike mentality, very similar to a slave's mentality. What now? What does that mean for you? Well, fourth point, final point. In the kingdom of heaven, all disciples are the greatest. You have this kingdom in which everyone is striving for the lowest place, but the result is they all get the highest place. It's like you go so far east, you end up in the west. I mean, it just happens that way. So, that's basically what Jesus says here. Now, I'm aware, as I was writing this, it sounded like the kind of thing that our society says, kind of being addicted to self-esteem and stuff like that, and egoism really is what self-esteem is. You know, this idea that everyone needs to feel good, so, oh, everyone's great. Everyone's the greatest. Everyone's special, which usually means no one is how that turns out. But that's the kind of thing society says to itself. And they say that to kind of nurture one another and kind of treat each other, kind of pamper one another. But the thing is, in the kingdom of heaven, it really is that way. We really have reached a state here, if you've done this whole humbling yourself like a child thing, you really have reached a place in which God has exalted all of us to the highest level, and we all become equally great. Jesus words his final answer to the disciples in a way that exalts all of them. Listen to what he says in verse 4. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus could have ended with any number of statements, right? There are more than one ways he could have closed this passage. He could have said, in the kingdom, no one is great. You're all childish slaves. No one is great. He could have said, in the kingdom, everyone is equally low. There is no rank because you're all down here. You're all equally worthless. That kind of thing. He could have said, in the kingdom, any sense of greatness is a complete delusion. There is no greatness in the kingdom. This kingdom is a kingdom of terrible people. He could have said stuff like that. Instead of saying any of those things, Jesus affirmed that his disciples, if they would be turned, if they would become like children in humility and enter the kingdom, that they would be the greatest in the kingdom. Not just great, but the greatest. They would reach the very top notch of what greatness is. The final word of Jesus on this matter is not that the disciples are unremarkable or insignificant or expendable. In spite of all the stuff about humbling yourself to the lowest state, the goal is not to say that we are that. The goal is actually to say that the disciples are all great in his kingdom. The only thing that these great disciples need to remember is that all disciples have that standing. As God looks at us, he doesn't apportion out these ranks like you do here in the world. God looks at us and has us all on this equally high level. I mentioned earlier that Jesus takes their question about being greatest in the kingdom and demotes them by telling them how to enter the kingdom, right? They ask about how to be the greatest. He says, well, let me tell you how to enter the kingdom. He kind of does this reversal on them. You might then expect Jesus to say, now that you're ready to enter the kingdom, you start off kind of on the bottom rung down here, and then maybe you get promoted, and then maybe you get promoted again, and then eventually you get to the greatest part later. That's how it works in the world, right? You start off low, you get kind of promoted by your boss, and you're all the way up, or your skill level increases so your worth goes up. That kind of thing. You might expect Jesus to do that because he talks to them about entering the kingdom rather than being great in the kingdom. So you start off low and you work your way up to a high point. But that's not what Jesus says. There is no working your way up because once you get in, you go straight to the top. You go straight from entering the kingdom to being greatest in the kingdom. Listen to how he words it. Verse 3 and 4. Think about this. Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Did you notice that the requirement for being greatest in the kingdom is the same as the requirement for entering the kingdom? Once you meet that requirement of being converted and becoming as humble as a child, once you meet that requirement, you not only enter the kingdom, you become greatest in the kingdom. He gives the same requirement for both things. And since it's the same requirement, all those who enter the kingdom are also greatest in the kingdom. You step in the door, you're in straight at the top. I mean, what other explanation is there? He gives the same requirement for both of them. It's not like he gives this requirement for entering the kingdom and then this second different requirement for getting to the top notch in the kingdom. It's the same requirement. Humble yourself, become like a child, and then you enter/be greatest in the kingdom. It's all one thing for him. It's amazing. Among the disciples, you have a diversity of knowledge. By disciples, I mean Christians in general. You have a diversity of knowledge, various gifts, and humanly speaking, there are degrees of esteem in which we esteem certain people more than others. But none of that changes the fact that everyone who enters the kingdom is regarded by Christ as the greatest. In spite of all the diversity, in spite of the different ways we esteem people, and in spite of all of those things, in Christ's eyes, we are all the greatest because we have entered the kingdom. Now, you may not believe me, and maybe some other passages are coming to mind here that you might wonder how I treat those. So let's talk about that. This stuff about all being equally the greatest. A few other passages have bearing on this, and they're both in Matthew. So Matthew 5 is one of them. I did think of this as I was preparing. I would say the only people who are least in the kingdom are those who never enter it. The way Jesus talks about it, if you want to sort of make somebody least in the kingdom, the people who are least in the kingdom are those who never even get through the doors. And you get this from Matthew 5, verse 19 and 20. He says, "Whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom." So the one who totally rejects the commands of Christ and fails to get beyond the level even of a Pharisee, that's the one who's least in the kingdom. What about everyone else? What about those who get past the level of a Pharisee? What about those who teach the commandments of Christ and actually do them? They're great. Least, great. There's no rankings here. You go from being the least to being the greatest if you make that turn from being someone who disregards the commands of Christ to someone who actually follows Christ. You go straight from one to the other, least to great. And there's no idea that those that are actually in the kingdom have any kind of ranking imposed on them. I know of only one place where Jesus refers to any disciple as least in the kingdom, and I think he does it for a reason. Go to Matthew 11 here. Matthew 11, verse 11, actually. This is in that section where Jesus is talking about John the Baptist. He says, "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he," greater than John. The one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist. And I think Jesus only speaks that way to emphasize that even if you think you're a nobody, you're still greater than the greatest of men simply by being in Christ's kingdom. You say, "Oh, I'm nobody, I can't do anything right, I'm a terrible Christian." Well, Jesus says you're even greater than John the Baptist. If you are that least in the kingdom kind of person, you're still greater than one of the greatest men that had been born ever up till that point, which is just another form of greatness. I mean, he calls them the least in the kingdom to emphasize how great they are. So even when he uses language like that, it's geared toward talking about how great it is to be in the kingdom and how great the people of the kingdom are. It's all geared around being great in the kingdom and how those in the kingdom of heaven are great. And if you still don't see it, think about our primary analogy from this passage. Children. The primary teaching tool that Jesus uses in this passage. Think about children and the bearing that has on this question of how greatness works. The chief difference between a slave and a child is love, right? The love of a parent in particular. I said a lot about making children and slaves the same kind of thing, but there actually is one very important difference, and that is love. A slave is not beloved of his master the way a child is beloved of his parent. There is a very different way of viewing these people, whether you're a slave or my child. If you're my slave, I view you with one kind of attitude, one kind of emotion, one kind of idea. If you're my child, that's totally different. It's much better. Now, you parents, okay, tell me, do you have a ranking system for your children? Do you have some kind of thing on your wall where you say, "Okay, kids, we're going to see who's the greatest"? and you did this, so you're greater than him today, and maybe you can be greater tomorrow, and you just kind of rank your kids in that way. No, of course not. No parent does that. The whole idea of ranking your children is absurd to all but the worst parents. You might grade them in how well they do their schoolwork. You might, talk to them a certain way based on how well they did their chores. But in terms of how you view them as your children, they're all your children. I mean, you love them all equally. There's no ranking there. And I'm sure your kids have unequal skills and virtues, and they're not all equal in that sense. But in your affections, your children are not just equal, but equally great to you. I mean, they're high. I mean, your list of priorities, the things you treasure, the things you value, your children are up there. And they're all up there on the same level, not ranked according to your favoritism, unless you're a very bad parent. So tell me, why would you think that the sons and daughters of the kingdom of God would be subjected to a ranking system? If we are God's children, if we really are the sons of God, as Jesus implied in this earlier passage about the tax, if we really are sons of God, why would he impose a ranking system on us? Why would he say, okay, you're the greatest, and you're kind of great, and you're not that great, and you're way down here, and you're the least in the kingdom? Why would he do that in his kingdom? If God is a father and we are his children, why would he rank us from least to greatest? God has certainly made us to be different, and even different kinds of Christian. And we have different gifts, we have different experiences. God treats us in different ways sometimes, and God has different plans for us. And in so many ways, there is a lack of equality among us, in a lot of ways. Especially, I think, in terms of Christ-likeness. Some Christians are more mature than others. Some Christians have learned more. Some Christians have done better and been more diligent in actually living like Christ. But all of that is over here. And God's love for you as a child of God is over here. All this stuff that makes us unequal, that's over here. But God's love for us is equal and great. Equally distributed. And there's no favoritism there. And as God's children, we should not expect to be ranked, because that's not how love works. Love does not work that way. Which means we are all equally the greatest in God's kingdom. If God loves us all equally, and his love is the great determining factor in our lives, we're all in the top spot. As God looks on this world and the people of this world, there's this group of people called Christians that are all equally high in his affections and are therefore all equally great. Whatever you say about our maturity, whatever you say about the different gifts we have, whatever you say about anything else, we are all equally the greatest in terms of being God's children, because he loves us all equally. And that is the lowly greatness of God's children. It is pursuing a low standing, a status that is little better than a mere child or a slave, but it's great because of what makes it great. It's the love of God for his children that makes us great in his kingdom and makes us all equally great. You have to humble yourself to get there. You have to humble yourself like a child, and yet when you do that, you attain this greatness in the kingdom of heaven. I do want to review my message points here just to bring them all in front of your mind again. We started off with, in chapter 17, my first point, the comments of chapter 17, I think I said 17, the comments of Jesus about the royal sons create this question about greatness in the kingdom. When they encounter this stuff about the tax, and Jesus likens them to sons of God, sons of a king, it brings about this question about greatness. However, Jesus also treats those royal sons like unbelievers for that question about greatness, because apparently in their mind, and you see this later on, they're not entirely innocent in the way they're approaching this. It may be logical to ask the question, but in their own minds and hearts, they are trying to outdo one another. And so Jesus deals with them very much like unbelievers. He uses language about them, which is perhaps more fitting for an unbelieving audience. And then he tells them that to humble yourself like a child is to embrace the lowest standing in the kingdom. And this is where I talked about childhood being a lot like slavery. And so humbling yourself like a child is to adopt that kind of lowly state where you view yourself as being not really much better than a slave. But in the same token, I mean, they're doing that, humbling yourself as a child in that way, in the kingdom of heaven, makes you the greatest. And all of us equally the greatest. Once we enter the kingdom, once we humble ourselves like children in that way, we become all equally the greatest, because we are all equally loved of God as His children. And that is the end of all striving. This thing that Christians so often deal with, trying to live the life, trying to do better, like, oh, I'm such a miserable sinner, I just can't get this right. Trying to strive forward here, being fearful about how God views you, fearful about whether you'll be of any worth to Him in your service to Him. This concept brings an end to all of that. Once you realize that in God's eyes, He already has us on this equally great standing, once we've entered the kingdom and embraced this childlike role, once we get there, we're already at the highest level. A child who strives to be the favorite of his parents will look like a fool and be hated by the other children. Any of you kids out there trying to get in really good with mom or dad, trying to make yourself their favorite, you're being stupid in doing that, because that's not how it works. That's not how your parents view you. And that's not how God views us. Not at all. Those Christians who strive to treat it differently, who strive to be greater than the other Christians, like James and John asking for the right hand and the left hand in Christ's kingdom, I mean, they look absolutely ridiculous in that passage doing that. We laugh at their cowardly boldness. They had the boldness to ask the question, but they got their mom to do it. It's just silly. It's a silly thing. And it's silly primarily because that's not how the kingdom works. That's not how God views us. God doesn't rank us in that way. It's just not like that. There's no need to strive, therefore. There's no need to try to get ahead of the game. There's no need to try to outdo other Christians or try to make yourself into something great, because you're already up there. You're already at that level of greatness. Children don't need to strive for the love of parents, and Christians don't need to strive for the love of God. He's already given it. He's given it in the fullest measure. Christ is our great token of that in dying for us. We're already at the top. We're already at the absolute top. And if we are now in the kingdom of heaven, if we've humbled ourselves as children, if we've been converted, to use Jesus' term, if we've done that, if we've sought this greatness through the childlike humility, we have the greatness already. That is what God has for us. He doesn't have this ranking order here and now in His kingdom. There's just His love that takes us all to the top. As long as you've entered that kingdom as a child would enter it, in the humblest state. And that is, I think, the message and goal of this rebuke Jesus gives to His disciples, but also this encouraging word that greatness actually is there in fullest measure for those that have humbled themselves in this way. There was a lot that I wanted to say there. If there are questions, we can field those, or further comments that want to be made, we can do that too. Does anyone have anything